So after arrays, it's now time to learn about another data structure in JavaScript, which is objects. So up until this point, we have been using arrays as a data structure to basically store multiple related values in the same variable. So let's just quickly recap that. So Jonas array, and you don't need to write this code. Okay, I'm really just trying to recap here. So we had the first name, and you see that I'm writing this in multiple lines now, and that is perfectly acceptable. So sometimes that's easier to give us an overview of a data structure, as long as we remember the commas here after each of the elements, we're going to be fine. So then we have kind of this age calculation here. Then we had the job and even an array of friends. So we have an array inside an array. So Michael, Peter, and Stephen. So again, this is basically a data structure which combines multiple values which all belong to this Jonas entity. Now we know intuitively that this first element here of the array should be called the first name. And this one is the last name. This one could be called age. This one could be called job. And this one could be called the friends. But in arrays, there's no way of giving these elements a name. And so we can't reference them by a name, but only by their order number in which they appear in the array. And so to solve that problem, we have another data structure in JavaScript, which is objects. So in objects, we actually define key value pairs. And so then we can give each of these values here a name. So let's see how. So again, we're defining a variable. And so I'm calling this one Jonas now. And then this is the actual object. So now instead of the square brackets that we use for arrays, we use the curly brackets or curly braces. So this is the second time we're seeing the curly braces. First, we saw them to define a code block, for example, in an if-else statement or if a switch statement, or even to define a function body. But this is different. Okay, so these curly braces here are to define a new object. And so let's now fill up this object with key value pairs. So the key is basically the variable name. So let's say first name, then a colon, and then the value. And the value can be of any type that we want here. Then to define another key value pair, we just separate them with commas, just like in the array. So last name, and then colon, remember, Schmetman, then the age, and once more, we can put any expression here. So this will be calculated and then will be assigned to age. Then the job, which is teacher, and finally the friends. And let's just copy this array from here. Okay, and so with this we have now an object which contains 5 key value pairs. So again, these are the 5 keys, and then each key has a value. And so essentially with this, we were able to assign a name to each of these values that we had. So that's something that was impossible in arrays, but now it is possible. Now each of these keys is also called a property. So we say that this object here, so this object, which is called Jonas, has 5 properties. So property first name with the value of Jonas, property last name with the value of Schmetman, and so on and so forth. Now, objects are probably the most fundamental concept in the whole JavaScript language. So there are many ways of creating objects. And simply writing an object in the code like this is probably the simplest way of creating an object. So here with the curly braces. So there are multiple ways of creating objects, but again, using the curly braces like this is the easiest one, and it's called the object literal syntax, because we are literally writing down the entire object content. So to recap, just like arrays, we use objects to essentially group together different variables that really belong together, such as the properties of Jonas that we've been working with. Now, the big difference between objects and arrays is that in objects, the order of these values does not matter at all when we want to retrieve them. And that's important to keep in mind. So in arrays, the order in which we specify the elements matters a lot, because that's how we access these elements, right? So we can only access array elements using their order number. This means that we should use arrays for more ordered data and objects for more unstructured data, and data that we actually want to name and then retrieve from the object based on that name. But how do we actually do that? So how do we get data from an object? And that's exactly what the next lecture is about. So see you there in a second.